city people, and as city people, they are not into land that much, but they were absentee landlords. So my grandfather.
Dr. Aruri, would you begin by sketching the background to the Oslo Agreement in terms of the Clinton administration's makeup and of the world's balance of power?
Well, the Oslo Agreement actually came after 22 months of negotiations in Washington following Madrid. Negotiations that took about 11 rounds that were really fruitless. They were going nowhere. And the reason for that, of course, is because the Palestinian delegation had instructions from Arafat and from the executive committee that they must stand firm on the question of occupation, that we are dealing with Israel as an occupant. And therefore, Israel must come to terms with its status as an occupier under international law. Otherwise, Israel will continue to claim sovereignty. Because of that impasse, I think Mr. Arafat decided that the only way to resolve it is to surrender on the issue after having given his delegation strict instructions to adhere to it. So I think Oslo can really be understood in terms of the impasse, in terms of the unwillingness of Israel to make any concessions whatsoever regarding the occupation, and in terms of the PLO inability to handle the situation in any other way except to accommodate. And so they accommodated. Now, with regard to the Clinton administration, you pointed out in terms of the Clinton administration, I think that many people said at the time of Oslo last year that the Americans were taken by surprise. That this was done in Europe, away from Washington, away from American policymakers. But in fact, it was really American policy that contributed to Oslo. That is to say that the decisions made by Mr. Bush and that were also continued and elaborated and rather expanded really by Mr. Clinton. Much of it was really in favor of Israel, because I think that Clinton has really gone farther than any other American president in embracing the Israeli position. I think that American policy created the circumstances which paved the road from Madrid to Washington to Oslo and then back to Washington for the signing ceremony. So indeed, Mr. Clinton was not really absent from the process, and I think it was a vindication of American policy. I think it was a victory really for American policy, which, unlike many analysts who say American policy has been rather irrational, fragmented, disjointed, and so on, I really find that American policy has been very consistent in terms of its objectives. And the objective was always to ensure U.S. hegemony in the area for socioeconomic reasons, and also for reasons that have to do with access to the resources of the region, and to ensure that the opposition movement is held in check. But I think that the changes were really stylistic changes over these years. So what happened in Oslo was really a victory for American foreign policy, and it was also a victory for Israeli policy, naturally. The global situation at that time was really so opportune for both America and Israel. And so the Palestinians were facing a very difficult situation at the local level. At the regional level, they were deprived of any Arab support, and at the global level, they were facing a new world order that was based on US hegemony. That is not really to say that the only alternative for the Palestinians was to surrender, basically, which is what they did in Oslo. I mean, although I think many apologists in the movement are using that. However, that's a different question.
Yes, you hear an argument circulating these days that the U.S. no longer has the kind of investment it used to have in Israel because of its new alliances with Arab countries as a result of the Gulf War.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to that claim?
Well, I think that the United States has, I wouldn't even say the same investment. I mean, to the same degree, but even more in Israel after the end of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. The theory went like this. The conventional wisdom is that Israel was an asset, a strategic asset, and it was promoted to a unique strategic asset under Reagan because of the Cold War and because Israel was going to be utilized against the Soviet Union during this confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. I think that this was not the case because the Cold War was not just about the Soviet Union and the United States. I mean, I think that if one looks at the Cold War, you find that there was a good deal of stability in retrospect there. And I think that the US and the USSR were involved in a relationship that can be considered as a form of antagonistic collaboration. I think that the North-South issue is really one that figures, to my mind, more prominently in the Cold War than the Soviet Union and the United States. That is not to say, of course, that the US and the Soviet Union were buddies and allies. But Israel was not seen as a bulwark against Soviet expansion because the Americans did not fear Soviet expansion. I mean, we all saw how the Soviet Union came crumbling down like a house of cards. So the Americans were not really fearful of the Soviet Union, did not have to have Israel to stand as bulwark. Israel's role was, and still is, as a bulwark against oppositional movements. I think it was a bulwark against radical Arab nationalism during the Nasser period and after that. Then it would be also used as a shield and as a striking force, as an attack dog, basically, against any force or combination of forces that were deemed to be in opposition to U.S. hegemony and to U.S. goals. Whether these can be called, fundamentalists, Islamists, progressives, Iran, Libya, etc., etc. And now I think that the end of the Cold War adds a new dimension to it. Mm-hmm. And that is the fact that you have so many countries that were in the Soviet orbit in the past who are searching now for a role and who are undergoing some change. And don't forget that a lot of them are Islamic. The Uzbek Republic and the others in the former Soviet Union. Israel already has a role there. And they do have a mission there. There is American money that's already been sent, and Israel is providing the technical assistance. So the U.S. sees Israel as a pace setter. You see, as a pace setter in what used to be the Soviet Union, particularly in the Islamic areas. So the concept of a strategic asset, I think, it is still there as it used to be during the Cold War, because the North-South issue is still an issue, and because oppositional movements are still there, even though they may look dormant for the time being, and thirdly, because of the new situation that was created in the Islamic part of the Soviet Union and Israel's role in it. particularly when Israel is seen as the alternative to Iran, for example. I mean, the US does not want Iran to be the pace setter in these Islamic republics. They want Israel to be the one. So indeed, the strategic utility, I think, of Israel is there, and I think that it has really become even more valuable for the US now.
The strategic role of Israel, can you speak to Israel's role in other regions of the world, say in South Africa and Central America as well?
During the Cold War, of course, Israel was one of the main suppliers of technology of repression and arms to the many unsavory regimes in Central America. I mean, to the worst dictatorships, to the worst fascist dictatorships in Central America, in Africa, and in Asia. Mainly because Israel would be able to avoid the human rights scrutiny. Israel is not subjected to that scrutiny as much as the US government would be. I mean, here you have congressional voices that would be raised against the Contras, against the US supplying weapons here and there. And so Israel was able to do that. I mean, what Israel did in Guatemala, for example, supplying them with the computerized technology of having lists of all kinds of dissidents in the country and so on. I know that in the aftermath of the Cold War, many of these conflicts are on their way to be resolved, which means that Israel now is not needed to the same extent as it was during the Cold War, but still it was able to make adaptation. Particularly, it did have the presence in these African, Central American countries, and so that presence really is still there, and it's being utilized in ways that would suit the changing conditions.
You mentioned that Israel isn't subjected to scrutiny of its human rights abuses, and I know that you worked with Amnesty International for years. Could you speak about some of those human rights abuses that were monitored by Amnesty International and human rights groups against human rights abuses against the Palestinians?
I think that regarding the work of Amnesty and its monitoring, some monitoring was done, but perhaps not to the extent that one would really expect from a major human rights organization. It did cause me some anguish when I was on the board, particularly as I was aware of the slow process of trying to make decisions on these matters. You see, Amnesty is an organization that has a very limited, sort of well-defined mandate. And so it does not really get involved in all sorts of abuses. It focuses on the plight of prisoners. It did not deal with such things as house demolition. It did not deal with such things as deportation or expulsion from territory. So its mandate was limited. And that, I think, became frustrating to many people, to many of the activists in Amnesty and some of its board members, because Amnesty wanted to be deliberate, wanted to be accurate, and it had to really weigh also the political effect of its decisions. So what I'm saying is that an attempt was made, I think, to monitor, but I think it really fell short of encompassing the whole spectrum of violations of human rights. Middle East Watch, that I worked with also for 2 years on its board, shortly after it was organized, was able to deal with the subject perhaps in a freer, it did have a freer hand. And that's mainly because Middle East Watch did not have the kind of constituencies that Amnesty did. Amnesty is a grassroots movement. Middle East Watch is not. Middle East Watch decisions were made by board and staff, and once the decision is made, the staff are ready at work, and so they were able to respond to the situation very, very quickly. Whereas with Amnesty, the decisions have to really come all the way from the bottom, and by the time they reach the top, sometimes it's too late really to react. I noticed that difference, I think, between the two organizations. And yet the two organizations were very cognizant of the political realities. So Middle East Watch is not really, outside that picture. That Middle East Watch was heavily Zionist. I mean, it really was heavily Zionist.
Okay.
Yeah, and therefore it should not be taken as something superior to Amnesty International. But I think it's basically the structure of it really is what helped it get to things quickly. I remember one time we had a retreat with Amnesty because they were really cognizant of their of the fact that they were running behind Middle East Watch, and they were doing some soul searching as to what is being done wrong. At that time, I had just finished my term with Amnesty, and I was on the board of Middle East Watch. And I told them bluntly, I said, well, you asked me to come here and to talk about it, and I'm telling you, I said, Middle East Watch, by the time you guys get your act together, Middle East Watch will have published 2 reports. I said, your process is just too slow in the name of accuracy. I mean, I know that you have to be accurate, but at the same time, sometimes you have to forge ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned that it no longer mentions Israel as an occupying power, and another limitation is that it doesn't deal with the human rights abuses of the Palestinians. Could you talk about the specific limitations of the accord and the repercussions of the accord for the Palestinians?
Well, I think that the accord should really be looked at as signifying a major departure in the nature of the struggle of the Palestinians that has been going on for decades throughout this century. I think it's a departure in the sense from what was conceived to be throughout the world and what was known to be in Palestinian communities in Palestine and around the world as a struggle of a nation for self-determination, for trying to put together what was destroyed in 1948, try to salvage what was occupied in 1967, and to try to reweave this thing into a nation, no matter how small it is. I think all of that seemed to really be coming to an abrupt end in Oslo at the Rose Garden. Because to me, as I look at Oslo tells me that the Palestinians are no longer struggling to establish a nation. It tells me also that Israel is telling the Palestinians that you have the right to live in this land, but under conditions that would be defined by us. That is to say, you have the right to live in a greater Israel, but not in Palestine. And I think that this is the tragedy, really. I think that this was reluctantly accepted. I doubt very much that the Palestinian leadership is not aware of this implication, which has historic dimensions. I doubt very much that they're not aware of it. But I think that is really what it means. Now, if one wants to go to the specifics of it, I mean, that's just in terms of an overview as I see it. The specifics are very, very disturbing. Even though Oslo says that the arrangements here are for a transitional period, I'm afraid that this transitional period is going to linger. And I'm afraid also that the leaders who signed it are not unaware of that fact. That's probably why Arafat, until the last minute in Cairo, before the signing, he said that he was not going to sign, and there was a scene actually that that was very unusual in diplomacy, and with so many people, so many eyes being focused on this event. I think that Arafat was trying to get every inch, every kilometer that he was able to get, because why would he care so much about the size of Jericho if this is really a transitional period? I think that in his heart of hearts, he knew that this may be the end of it. And so therefore, the Gaza-Jericho first is the Gaza-Jericho last as well. I think that it is widely perceived, it's widely felt in the occupied territories and among Palestinians that this may be the first and last. So Oslo is based on this notion of two stages. Now we're talking about the short term, but good things may follow in the long term. I don't really see it that way, because I think that this agreement sets the pace. I think it does really provide the framework for what is going to follow. Its dangers are that for the first time, the Palestinians implicitly accept Israel as an occupier. It is one thing to have an occupation imposed on you and to resist the occupation. It's quite another thing for the occupied, for the victims, to give any sort measure of legitimacy to the occupier. No matter how you look at it, I think that that legitimacy was conferred upon the Israelis by the representatives of the victimized nation. That did happen. Secondly, I think that another implication of the Oslo Agreement and the subsequent Cairo Agreement is that the Palestinians implicitly accepted the notion of apartheid. And I find this very disturbing, especially at the very time that apartheid is being dismantled, is being dismantled. I mean, at the same time that Mandela is proclaimed elected president of South Africa, Arafat signs an agreement which basically created so-called autonomous zones that are nothing really but a collection of Bantustans in what used to be Palestine. And this is something that was accepted by the leadership. Again, apartheid can be imposed on people, but for the victims of apartheid, to legitimize it, I think is rather unforgivable, really, to my mind. Regarding the human rights situation, there isn't a word in Oslo about human rights whatsoever, just like there isn't a single word about occupation. I mean, the fact that occupation exists there is not even acknowledged whatsoever in Oslo. It does not appear. So there's no context here for it. And yet Resolution 242, that's been the cornerstone of a settlement in the Middle East, talks about the occupation and the end of the occupation. You see. There's nothing. 242 is mentioned here, but of course Israel has its own interpretation of 242. Israel does not regard the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza as occupied. They felt that when they withdrew from the Sinai Peninsula and dismantled the settlement of Yamit, they fulfilled their obligations under 242.
What about the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza and Jericho and the implementation of a Palestinian police force in those areas? Is that going to have any effect on Palestinian lives and this?
Well, go ahead, yes.
How does that shape what the terms of the limited autonomy are?
Yeah. Well, I think that what happened here in Cairo and Jericho after the signing of the Cairo Agreement on May 4th, 1994, is going to have some effect there on the Palestinians. There's no question about it. I mean, I think that we've seen jubilation. You have people who have been under repression, severe repression, abject conditions for 27 years. Naturally, they are going to feel happy to see Palestinians in uniform there, despite the fact that these Palestinians in uniform are really hemmed in by the agreement, are really expected to work together jointly with Israeli forces to keep the Palestinians under control. And so there's a honeymoon here. And I think that honeymoons usually don't last very long, although some honeymoons can lead to the real thing. So I really object to the term honeymoon. Maybe I shouldn't use this, and you can edit this out. I just thought about the honeymoon concept here in that respect. So,
although one side is going to get screwed.
yeah. The so-called autonomy in Gaza and Jericho, actually, it is not referred to as autonomy in the Cairo Agreement. Autonomy was used in Camp David. In fact, at Camp David, language was full autonomy. And that adjective, full, was very important because full autonomy to Sadat and to Carter, I think, meant legislative power, that's something that is real self-determination that really borders on statehood, just below statehood. Now, under the Oslo and the Cairo Accord, there is no full autonomy, there is no autonomy. The term here is limited self-government. So the Palestinians will be living basically in a Bantustan. They do not have any control over security. Their entry to these so-called autonomous zones, their exit from them, are subject to Israeli control. They will not be able to interact with foreign governments. They may do so to some extent at the economic level, but you see, within the context of Israeli control of the borders, Israeli control of security, and that means Israel will be defining borders with the Jordanians and not with the Palestinians. That Jordan will be concluding a peace treaty with the Jordanians, with the Syrians, but not with the Palestinians. The Palestinians have already accepted being an ethnic group, as I said, in a greater Israel and not in Palestine.
Okay. So could you elaborate on the limitations of the Oslo Accord and the repercussions of the accord for the Palestinians?
Yes. Well, actually, the Oslo Accord and the Cairo Agreements. I mean, the Oslo Accord going to October 1993 and the Cairo Agreement May 1994. I think that the Oslo Accord, which is the Declaration of Principles, it is something that can be seen not as an agreement, but really an agreement to reach agreement. It's an agreement to reach agreement. That is how it was considered. Certainly that's how the Israelis are considering it. That's how the Americans are considering it. Now, this agreement, of course, was the Cairo Agreement, and so it's presumably an implementation of the principles adopted in Oslo. And so there aren't many differences between Oslo and Cairo. Cairo is more concrete. I mean, Oslo takes about a page in the New York Times. The Cairo Agreement, with its annexes and maps, adds up to about 250 pages. Now, when you talk about 250 pages, I think it raises questions about who reads these pages. How many people really read that kind of thing? The other thing is that the text was available in English only. It was not really done in Arabic. And there's something to be said about the ability of negotiators to deal with the English language. I mean, some of them obviously did not have a working knowledge of the English language. These are very, very important questions. Quite frankly, when I read the Cairo Agreement with its annexes, I was shocked. My initial reaction was utter disbelief. How can anyone sign an agreement like this? The Israelis are very, very careful about the nuances, the language, the legal terminology. They have a legal staff in the foreign ministry rather experienced, and they tend to be very Talmudic in their approach. I think that they weigh every sentence, every comma, every semicolon, everything has a meaning. And I think that this really contrasts with a different attitude among the Palestinian negotiators, who tended to not view it in such meticulous terms and in the legal terms that the Israelis have viewed it. For example, reading some of the analyses of the agreements by Israeli jurists, some of whom were involved in the negotiations, where they give the Israeli interpretation of it, it would lead one to the conclusion that the Palestinians were really sold a bill of goods, as they say. Naturally, it's their responsibility to check these things out and to make sure that what they signed is something that they really fully understand. But here, what we see is that there is something in the Cairo Agreement that is referred to as cooperation, joint committees. There is a whole network of joint committees. When you look at this cooperation in Oslo and the joint committees in the Cairo Agreement, you really conclude, you cannot but conclude, that what Israel gave the Palestinians amounts to nothing in terms of decision making. The term joint committees is euphemistic, because with a joint committee, the Palestinians are being deprived of making decisions that affect their lives without Israeli concurrence. Israel has a veto on all matters. Inasmuch as Israel is a member of every single committee that deals with civil affairs, that deals with security, that deals with natural resources. And then there are subcommittees. Take, for example, there is a subcommittee known as the Subcommittee on Legislation, which has an equal number of Israelis and Palestinians. Presumably the Palestinians have the power to legislate under Oslo and under Cairo. Yet, within 30 days of any so-called legislative enactment, the legislative subcommittee can determine whether this piece of legislation enacted by the Palestinian Council is in consonance with the spirit and letter of the agreement as they see it. I mean, this is the concept of not exactly judicial review as we have it in the Supreme Court, practiced by the Supreme Court. There used to be judicial boards and judicial review boards and so on. So that this is more like a judicial board, really, that you submit your legislation to the board and then the board will tell you whether this is okay or not, whether it's legal or not. This is just but one example. If you look at the question of security, the Palestinian police cannot arrest any Israeli who may come to the so-called autonomous zones and would commit an offense, a crime of any kind. All the Palestinian police can do is to call an Israeli unit. They have joint patrols, and so that the Israeli unit would come and they will do the arresting. I think that the Palestinians have accepted the outmoded concept, the 19th century concept of extraterritoriality that subordinated the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire to the West completely, which warranted the term the sick man of Europe, whereby a Westerner who would commit a crime in a zone of influence for the British or the French in China would not be subjected, would not be tried in accordance with Chinese law, but in accordance with British law or French law. This is the same sort of thing here in the 20th, at the end of the 20th century, that is happening in Gaza and Jericho and in the West Bank. The concept of extraterritoriality is being upheld here. Basically, Therese, what is happening really with Cairo is that the Palestinian leadership accepted Israeli illegal measures that have been practiced during the occupation for 27 years, and the agreement gives legitimacy to these violations. Violations in terms of people's rights, people's freedom to move, people's resources, their means of existence. These are accepted in the Cairo Agreement. And that's really what's incredible about it.
Why do you think the Palestinian leadership has agreed to this kind of surrender, as you call it? Is it in a very weak position now?
Well, I think that the Palestinian leadership in Tunis felt that they could not really back away from a settlement. That after the Gulf War, they made the decision to embark on the road to Madrid, the diplomatic road to Madrid, and that they did receive assurances from Mr. Baker, a letter of assurances that seemed to meet their minimal demands. And I think that they felt at the time that since they were deprived of that international framework, the UN resolutions that would guarantee their rights, then they might as well accept the American assurances by Mr. Baker, since they were done in writing. Therefore, they went to Madrid feeling somewhat confident that this letter of assurances will give them sufficient cause to feel comfortable about the outcome. Because the letter of assurance says that there's an occupation, the occupation must come to an end. It recognizes the rights of Palestinians in Jerusalem. It talks about refugees. And most importantly is that there is an occupation and that the occupation will have to come to an end. But you see, after 22 months, as we talked about it before, it became well known that Israel was not going to do anything that would really give the letter of assurances any credibility. And so the Palestinians, or Mr. Arafat, I think decided to just go ahead and accept the conditions. Why? One reason I think is because he was fearful that the new administration in Washington, which has gone farther than any other previous administration in embracing the Israeli position, was not going to change whatsoever. I think that he felt that if he does not go along, that the Israelis and the Americans would find someone else to meet their terms. And quite frankly, I think that Mr. Arafat was a bit undecided for a while as to whether it is really the cause of Palestine or whether his cause, whether his interest and his leadership, which one should really come first. And it seems to me that in the end, he somehow failed to distinguish between his career and between the cause itself. And I think that he opted for his career. He wanted to stay in power, and that's the only way for him to stay in power. Mr. Arafat is a man who's used to going around the world and to be received as an important leader. Well, naturally, he was received as an important leader because he represented the cause of Palestinians. Now, for him to continue to do so can only happen with the blessings of the U.S. and Israel. And I think that if the U.S. and Israel feel for a moment that he crossed the line, then he will be told. And in fact, that's what happened in South Africa when he made that remark in the mosque about jihad in Jerusalem, and he urged jihad, and that became very controversial. I think he was being reminded by the Americans and the Israelis, and the press, of course, did the job. I mean, that's the role of the press, after all, is to call attention to these important things that the establishment, wants to deal with. And the press really made an issue out of it, and they were in effect telling him that, we do have an unwritten agreement, Mr. Arafat. Now, when you talk about jihad, you're not going to be able to travel, and you're not going to be able to be received, because we can put restrictions on that. I think that Arafat came to accept in the end and acknowledge the reality that his continued prominence is contingent on American and Israeli acquiescence or approval.
So, can you explain the struggle over Jerusalem? What's the meaning behind Arafat's call for jihad in reclaiming Jerusalem? And why has it been a key factor? What role has it played in the negotiations?
In the negotiations, Jerusalem is one of the important issues that were deferred in accordance with the Oslo Accord. Jerusalem, settlements, borders, refugees, land, all the important issues that constitute the Palestinian question were deferred. The only thing we're talking about is a modality for the self-governing authority that's going to rule, that's going to do the governing instead of Israel, so that Israeli boys will get out and would not have to do the dirty work. And so Jerusalem is just like the other important issues to be deferred. Now, during the transitional phase, what role for the people of Jerusalem? Is there any role for them? Yes. Oslo says that anybody who has a Jerusalem residency will be able to vote in the elections for the Palestinian Council, but no one from Jerusalem will be able to stand for election. Why? Because they want to prove the point that Jerusalem's status is non-negotiable. Sovereignty over Jerusalem is non-negotiable. That's what I meant before when I said they were very Talmudic, that they weigh every single thing and the implication of every decision they make. The elections, I mean the polling stations, is that what they call them? Will not be anywhere inside Jerusalem, even within the newly defined borders of Jerusalem. They would have to be outside Jerusalem, like in Ramallah. Again, so that nobody can say that, well, Palestinians from Jerusalem voted in polls, stations within this city.
And there's been an attempt by the Israeli government to close down PLO offices in Jerusalem as well.
They've attempted to do that exactly because I think that they are really keen on trying to disestablish and negate any Palestinian presence in Jerusalem that has the impact of a claim for a political presence which could translate into sovereignty in the end. And therefore, all these institutions there are really being vulnerable now. Secondly, the closure of Jerusalem, which began in March of 1993 and which continues today in June 1994. Ostensibly, it was a measure taken in order to make Israelis feel more secure because at that time there was increased violence and there were various acts of killings of Israeli soldiers. But I think that this was the perfect excuse for the Rabin government to exclude Jerusalem from any negotiations right now, and also to compel the Palestinians to readjust their life away from Jerusalem, to give them a chance for maybe 2-3 years or so to shift their attention away from Jerusalem, to try to reach Jerusalem through different means, and to also decrease their dependence on Jerusalem. Basically, to really remove Jerusalem from the equation. This is not just a decision really that was pursuant to increased acts of violence. With regard to the remarks you asked me about, the Arafat's remarks on Jerusalem in South Africa. Well, I mean, Arafat was talking to a Muslim audience in a mosque, and naturally he wanted to tell them that he, as a Muslim leader, did not really give up Jerusalem. In fact, he did, but he was telling them that he did not. Technically, I mean, he would say that we are only talking now about the transitional phase, you see, and therefore in the transitional phase, we haven't really dealt with Jerusalem. But when we come to the final status talks, maybe 2-3 years from now, we are indeed going to deal with Jerusalem. And the only way we are going to deal with it would be to talk about our rights in it. And so technically he's correct, you see, because really, technically, he hasn't given up anything. And he could tell the Israelis easily that when I urge people for jihad, jihad is not a concept to be seen only in the, within the context of the Western meaning of it, attributed to it. That is a holy war. Jihad is not necessarily a holy war. I mean, it used to be considered a holy war 1300 years ago. But today, in the 20th century, any form of struggle is jihad. So you struggle for your rights. And when you are addressing an audience in a mosque, you use the term jihad. You don't even have to be really addressing a mosque audience to use jihad. So he could easily tell the Israelis that, and I think he did, that I haven't really accepted your sovereignty over Jerusalem, and therefore I'm within my rights.
What other forms of resistance to the Oslo Agreement do you see? What other forms of struggle are emerging, both from the inside leadership inside the territories, from Palestinians in the diaspora, from various mass movements within the occupied territories, or have all this been put down by the terms of the agreement?
Well, unfortunately, the opposition to Oslo and to the Cairo Agreement is not really to the level that one might expect. And perhaps many people were surprised by it and dismayed by it. I think that one of the results of Oslo was to just put another nail in the coffin of the Intifada, which unfortunately suffered not only as a result of Israeli repression, but also as a result of Palestinian complicity at the highest level. I think that the general mood in the occupied territories is one not really of despair, but one of wait and see. There's been just a lot of sacrifices that have taken place, and there is a mood among people there that we've got to wait and see what's going to happen here. No one is really embracing Oslo and Cairo as good agreements that are going to bring something qualitatively better than what exists now. Yet at the same time, I don't really see any organized movement to oppose it effectively. And the initiative, I think, has been taken by the powerful forces. That is to say, the West, the US, Israel, Arafat as a sort of an auxiliary, an adjunct, in an adjunct role. The minute the agreement was signed in Cairo, I felt that the opposition suffered, because the opposition, to be effective, I think, should have been able to prevent it from happening. Now it's after the fact. I sound pessimistic somewhat about it, and I know that I do. But there are many people in the occupied territories who are unhappy with it. You also have a declaration that was signed by many noted and credible leaders, saying we consider it to be null and void because it really consecrates all the illegal practices that have been applied by Israel during the occupation. But I feel that this is not really enough, because there doesn't seem to be an organized movement in the street to try to bring it about. Maybe the dynamics of the situation, when it develops further, could bring this about, because the level of expectation and the level of achievement there may be a gap. I'm sure that there will be a gap there, and just depending really on how bad that gap is, you may see a new realities that will bring about a new forms of struggle. But I think we really are at a juncture now where we have a new situation in the occupied territories, and I'm afraid that the traditional leadership, whether it is opposition or establishment, are not really the ones that are going to bring about anything new to this situation.
I understand you're a member of a newly formed independent commission for human rights. Would you explain the makeup and the purpose of this commission and how the commission will be operating during the transitional period?
Yes, this is known as the Independent Commission for Citizens' Rights, and it's the brainchild of Hanan Ashrawi, who used to be the spokesperson of the Palestinian delegation in Washington, but she sort of distanced herself from the leadership when they went to Oslo after Washington. Hanan Ashrawi is the one who put it together, conceived of the idea, and also she was able to get a written commitment from Yasser Arafat in his capacity as the president of Palestine, a role which he subsequently gave up when he signed the Cairo Agreement. But the letter is signed by Yasser Arafat, president of the state of Palestine, creating the commission and assuring her that this commission would have access to the Palestinian offices in order to do its job. What is the job of this commission? The job of this commission is to act in the role of ombudsman, to be a watchdog on the new Palestinian Authority, to ensure that the legislation is compatible with the international covenants on human rights, and so that the human rights of people are not violated. So it's a watchdog, and at the same time it is supposed to have a quasi-judicial function without really stepping on the jurisdiction of the judiciary, so that presumably it would receive complaints from the public whenever violations of human rights are affected, and it can look into these violations and in these cases. Now, I accepted her invitation to become a member of it, and I accepted it, I think, with a great deal of anguish. First of all, because I'm not really sure that this authority is going to function as an authority that has truly legislative power. Quite dubious about this term legislation, especially now when you see in Cairo that you have a subcommittee that acts as a judicial board of review, in effect. And so you can ask, what really is the role of the commission on which I serve, and so on. Nevertheless, I accepted it, hoping that maybe it would develop into something. If it does, well and good. If it does not, then we've tried, and we failed. So it is really an experiment in trying to set up an ombudsman institution to scrutinize the work of the authority.
You mentioned that this commission would be monitoring human rights abuses by Palestinian authorities. Will it also monitor Israeli abuses? And is there a history of this kind of structure set up within Palestinian society, holding governmental authorities accountable to the people?
I think that the commission is primarily a watchdog on the Palestinian Authority, not the Israeli Authority, because the commission did not want to duplicate the work of Al-Haq, for example, and other human rights organizations like the Mandela Institute and others in the occupied territories. There's no need to duplicate, to create another organization. And that's why it's whatever authority it has, and it's basically moral authority at this point that we're talking about here. It will be really pursuant to this arrangement with the PLO that it would be a watchdog. An office like a controller, like an office of controller. So it will not really be paying much attention to Israeli violations. Secondly, you asked me about whether there is anything there in the Palestinian tradition. Well, actually, this role of ombudsman was there, and it was practiced in the Islamic State in the Middle Ages. In fact, the ombudsman, the Arabic word for it is muhtasib, al-muhtasib, and that comes from accountability, hisab, muhasaba, that's accountability. And so al-muhtasib is the one who holds accountable. And the muhtasib in the Islamic State did have a watchdog role, not only over the government, but also over merchants, to ensure that their exploitative practices were held to a minimum. So it is something that really was known to the Arab world, to the Arab Muslim world, prior to its discovery by the Scandinavians, who, by the way, are extending an invitation to the Commission that will, there's a visit there for our Commission that's scheduled for the 19th of June to have a seminar and see how this thing works in practice in Sweden, you see. So I go there feeling fairly comfortable in the fact that my people had practiced that in the past.
That's interesting. After the Hebron massacre, there was a lot of discussion about the settlement issue, whether the settlements should be dismantled, should they be removed. This kind of discussion, what do you think will be the fate of the settlements, especially in relation to the Cairo Agreement?
Well, I think that the settlements have really received legitimacy by the Cairo Agreement, which they have never seen before from Palestinians, even though it is implicit. The Palestinian calls for dismantling settlements after the Hebron massacre were taken by the Israelis and the Americans as just part of the anger, the expression of anger that will have to take its course, and it will have to just, happen, and just we'll give it some time for people to calm down. The dismantlement of settlements was never really on the active agenda of the Israelis, and it's not something to be taken seriously. Yet the Israelis understand that they would have to deal with the issue until emotions calm down. In fact, the Cairo Agreement resulted in giving the settlements more security, more continuity, and more land. Just let us look at the situation in Gaza as an illustration of what I'm saying. In Gaza, you have 4,000 settlers who now are going to be able to control something like 50% of the land in Gaza. They did not have that before. I mean, look at how obscene the statistics here. You've got 850,000 Palestinians, and you have 4,000 Israelis. The maps of the Cairo Agreement, which define Israeli territory, are known as the yellow maps. So the yellow territories now, there's a new term that is coming into the terminology of the Middle East. The yellow territories would be the territories that are under Israeli control. What happened to the settlements in Gaza is that since they were somewhat scattered, they had to somehow give them some contiguity. And you cannot give them contiguity and security unless you are going to take more land, and then the land needs also infrastructure. You need more roads to connect them with each other and to connect them with Israel proper. That process resulted in more than doubling the territory, the land, which were already used for these settlements. And what's ironic about this whole thing is that the Israeli government of Yitzhak Rabin has been very anxious for the past 2.5 years to give up Gaza. And if the Israeli government did not find a Palestinian to make that arrangement, they were willing to just simply withdraw from Gaza. Now, what I'm saying here is not something that is just based on speculation or anything like that. I mean, these were statements made by ministers in the Rabin government. A statement to this effect was made by the environment minister Yossi Sarit. He said it, that we were going to get out of Gaza anyway. Secondly, I have it from one of the delegates, Palestinian delegates to the peace negotiations in Washington before Oslo, that Israel gave them a piece of paper to the effect that they were really willing to get out of Gaza without concessions. Now they are getting out of Gaza under the terms of Oslo after having more than doubled the size of land for the settlements. Israel did not build settlements to vacate them. That's something that we heard over and over and over by Likud as well as by Labour. And by the time the settlement issue is going to be put on the agenda of the final status talks, this government may not be in power. Not to say that if it's in power, the outcome is going to be different. But it's quite conceivable that you will have a Likud government by that time. And I think that neither Likud nor Labour is going to be willing in the end to dismantle settlements. That, I think, is fairly understood by most people who deal with this issue, by most Palestinians. So the settlement issue, I think, has been pretty much decided already.
Well, is there anything else you would like to say to people doing organizing work in the United States in regard to the Palestinian issue? How can we continue to push for Palestinian self-determination, given the bleak picture painted by the Oslo and Cairo agreements?
Well, without doubt, I think that the situation that prevails now, especially after Oslo and Cairo, presented a real challenge and a dilemma to most of the activists in the United States. Particularly, I think, American activists who do not want to appear as they're acting more Palestinian than the Palestinians. You can't be more Catholic than the Pope. If Arafat signed on the dotted line and gave away the right of nationhood and independence in Palestine, why should I be running around in Detroit and in Brooklyn and in Washington talking about the right of Palestinians to self-determination? I think that some people presented that question. I know that many people asked me that question in talks that I gave and so on. And my answer to them was that you're not really being more Palestinian than the Palestinians. You don't have to worry about that. Now, the Palestinian leadership presumably did not surrender these rights. I think that maybe in fact they did, but on paper they did not do that. We still have the final talks, and even if they did, the situation has not really changed in the occupied territories. There is still an occupation. We've been struggling against occupation. What is happening here is redeployment, not withdrawal. The occupation is there. The military government is there. Civil administration may have been dismantled, but the military government is there. The military laws are still the laws of the land. The U.S. is still committed to Israel's continuous needs, military needs, as well as economic needs. And this, I think, poses a question to many Americans, not only as taxpayers, but also as Americans who are interested in a judicious foreign policy and in a foreign policy consistent with human rights. I mean, the laws here in the United States say that you cannot give arms to nations that have a consistent pattern of violations of human rights. And therefore, an activist has the right to insist that this government of ours should not be supporting states like Israel, which violates rights. Thirdly, you can also look at the situation here, where the media have already said that peace conditions are there, that peace prevails, that the Israelis are getting out, which is not the truth. And so if peace prevails, then why do we have to send so much money to buy weapons and to improve the security of the state at a time like this? So I think that there are really a lot of concerns for human rights activists and for activists for Palestinian political rights and national rights.
Thank you, Dr. Aruri.
You're very welcome. The only thing we didn't talk about is
the Constitution.
is the future of. I mean, I think that for example, what would it look like in Gaza? I mean, economically, that here. I mean, what is being contemplated here is that you have a lot of industrialists outside and Palestinian millionaires and others who are attracted by cheap labor. So is Gaza going to look like the maquiladoras there? I mean, to have Israel bring the factories to Gaza with Palestinian labor, and then the Palestinians would not have to be a security threat to Israel and so on. I mean, maybe we can talk about the and that should do it, about the economic future what is really the basis for this peace? I mean, this is the Shimon Peres concept of peace. Why is he so much for this? What is his dimension? What's his thing in it?
Let me,
You know?
let me start by asking
Yeah,
your
yeah.
question
This
on
thing
that,
here.
but-
Maybe we can conclude with that,
Okay.
or wherever you want to put it in there.
Great.
Okay. What do you think then that Israel has in mind for the long term, especially in terms of the economic situation for the Palestinians?
Yes, well, I think that Oslo for the Israelis is a milestone, not only in terms of Israel achieving its long desired aims of finding an Arab and a Palestinians to give it legitimacy after they found Sadat and before him Faisal during the First World War period, and now they have Arafat. But also, I think the economic dimension of this agreement is something that deserves to be looked at in itself. And in many ways, this agreement is being looked at as the brainchild of Shimon Peres. They say that he's really the smart one. He's the architect of the agreement. And what is he thinking about? Well, when you look at Israel, you find that Israel is a small nation that has really high level of human resources because it has at its disposal talents that are derived from a variety of countries in the world. I mean, more than 80 different countries in the world with all the expertise that really came to Israel. And therefore they do have brain power. They do have superior technology. They are really on the cutting edge. And I think that Israeli leaders like Shimon Peres see Israel as the mind and they see the Arab world as the body, you see. So Israel is the mind, it is also the heart. The Arab world is the body. And with the head and body and heart, they think that they're going to have a Middle East that will be run by them. Run by them not in the same way as they ran it during the Nixon days of the Nixon doctrine, the hose and water. You give us the hose and water and we provide the firemen and we will put down the fires of revolution here. We don't want to be the firemen and the policemen of the Arab world. We want to be the managers of the Arab world, you see. So we will manage it, we will manage its resources, we will organize it, the water, the petroleum, the infrastructure, the roads. Already you go now to Israel, you find that they have these major highways heading towards Damascus and Beirut and Cairo and Amman. They're just like roads that stop here and they're ready as soon as the signature is there, Assad's and Hussein's, then the building will extend. They are looking at that kind of a Middle East that will be organized by them. It has resources. What does Gaza have? What does Jericho have? The West Bank? Well, it has resources. They have cheap labor. They are also thinking of being able to get Palestinian millionaires and businessmen outside to invest. I mean, these millionaires are not going to be coming in here necessarily to develop their own country, although that's what they're going to be saying. But they are really attracted mainly by cheap labor. And therefore, Israeli know-how and Palestinian capital will probably create factories, build factories on the outskirts of Gaza so that the Gazans would not have to travel to Israel. Now, the Israelis will bring the factories to Gaza. And so you're going to have a bunch of Tijuanas there. There'll be a maquiladoras there and on the border between Gaza and Israel. This is the kind of thing that Israel is looking at, really. And of course, Israel now has changed. I mean, it is not really that state that has a population that is moved by ideological zeal and by wanting to live on the land, sacrifice and eat in collective halls and leave the kids at the nurseries and go to the kibbutzim. Now you have a class in Israel that has ambitions for a nice way of life, as they say it, nice vacations, golf courses, things like that. And I think that people like Shimon Peres and others who are pushing this agreement are telling the Israeli people that you are going to have a better life. And this is the price of peace. And so we're not really giving up anything. So when you look at this deal, it is probably one of the cheapest deals that has ever taken place in decades and decades in the world at large, and not just in the Middle East. I think for the Israelis it's not only cost effective, it is a real bargain.
Yes, that brings to mind an article I saw in The Economist after the agreement was signed. And it was about a 10-page article on the agreement, and within that article there were 8 advertisements for Israeli banks, encouraging investment in Israeli banks.
Yes.
So it seems like they have a lot to benefit from that arrangement, economically.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean the IMF thing is that I mean they basically want to find that there are competent people who are going who know how to deal with this with the money before they give it, and who would accept it on their terms. With the Palestinians, they have a real problem because I mean the only way Arafat can manage is to control it himself. I mean he's never had a treasury there. He's the one who signs checks, whether it's a I mean, people used to go to the Central Council meeting. They're coming from Amman, and they will give them a one-way ticket, and they're going from one office to the other to get a ticket to return. And at one time, I asked one of them. I said, "This is dumb." I said, why can't you guys get a return ticket? Why can't you get a round-trip ticket? It's cheaper." And so one person, he laughed. He said, "Well, you know, they bring us here on a one-way ticket, and they see how we vote. If we vote the right way, you know, it'll be easy to go back. If we vote the wrong way, they'll give us a hard time." I mean, who makes these decisions? Arafat.
Do you want to
So, the IMF is concerned about the budgetary process, about accountability, and so on and so forth. But I think that with regard to the philosophy of it, I mean, the World Bank is not concerned that there's going to be any opposition to the World Bank methods of development, quote unquote.
Yeah.
This is not development, basically. This they're not worried about at all, because I mean they see Arafat as very accommodating, and there's no one who's going to stand there and give the third world argument against the IMF. But I think what they're really concerned about are the issues that have to do with absorptive capacity, absorptive ability, rational decision making. And that's where they and the Palestinian millionaires tend to meet. Because, you know, last November, I got a hold of a declaration by Palestinian millionaires, well-known millionaires, where they signed a statement really criticizing Arafat, but not so much for signing Oslo, but because of being authoritarian and not delegating authority and not being able to run an efficient government. So they were coming from that vantage point. Efficiency, I mean the IMF thing. Efficiency, accountability. In many ways, you could meet with them and find yourself really endorsing their concerns, but you know where they were coming from. And I think that the IMF is concerned about that. Well, that was not was that recorded? Oh, okay. Because I thought that this was chatter.
It's okay.
But if you find that some of it, use it if you find.
So the red light means it's being recorded.
Yeah, I think
Yeah. I thought I was just rambling on. Yeah.